Cheselden's 1728 report of eye surgery in the congenitally blind. New information. In the late 1600s, congenital cataract surgery provided an opportunity to explore the fundamental nature of visual perception. In 1688, William Molyneux of Ireland proposed in a letter to John Locke that one born blind who suddenly acquired the ability to see would be unable to visually distinguish cubes from spheres, even if these had previously been known by a sense of touch. In 1690, Locke did not directly answer Molyneux's question, but did explicitly relate the cure of congenital blindness to cataract surgery. In 1694, Locke published Molyneux's question and wrote that he agreed with Molyneux. In 1709, Irish cleric and philosopher George Berkeley agreed with Molyneux that one suddenly brought to sight would not be able to visually distinguish cubes from spheres, and Berkeley added that the patient would also not be able to immediately judge distance and magnitude. Conventional accounts stipulate that the first credible empirical evidence regarding Molyneux's question came from the 1728 report of English surgeon William Cheselden, who is said to have restored to sight a boy who was born blind. This case has been discussed by prominent philosophers such as Diderot and Buffon over the last 3 centuries. In 1738, Voltaire wrote that Cheselden's patient was reluctant to consent, but that, quote, the operation was however performed and fully succeeded. The youth, then about 14 years of age, saw the light for the first time. This experiment confirmed all that Locke and Berkeley had justly foreseen, end quote. Cheselden's remains one of the most highly cited case reports from centuries ago. You can see here it's been cited 110 times. And Cheselden's other report on iridotomy that year was only cited 4 times. Now, we have new information which might call this case into question, however. None of the discussants has known the family story or the name of Cheselden's patient, whom we have now identified. The patient's father, Daniel Dolins, studied philosophy and mathematics in Utrecht in 1697. He returned to London and in 1700 married Margaret, the daughter of Thomas Cook of Hackney. Dolins was knighted in 1722. Dolins and his wife had 4 children, Abraham, Mary, Daniel, and Margaret. Both sons had bilateral cataracts and died as young adults. Daniel, the son, was Cheselden's patient. By 1721, surgery for congenital cataracts had been performed on children as early as age 18 months in Paris by John Thomas Woolhouse. However, that was atypical, and generally the patients would be couched when they were older, as seen in this anonymous portrait. Abraham Dolins, the older brother of our patient, was operated for one of his congenital cataracts at age 13. In a letter in October of 1714, the senior Dolins informed clergyman John Stripe, quote, it pleased God to afflict our eldest son with cataracts in both eyes from his birth. We design, God willing, to have him couched in one of them by Mrs. Jones on Thursday next. As with many women of the period, Mrs. Jones was from a family which had been practicing as oculists since the mid-1600s. Later, Dolins updated Stripe. The operation was yesterday very well performed by the divine assistance, and the child is as well as we can expect in so short a time. But we must wait with some patience for the ripening and dissolving of the matter before he can have his clean sight. In May 1715, Dolins informed Stripe, Mrs. Jones designs, God willing, on Wednesday next to renew the operation on one of my son's eyes in order to remove some remaining strings which obstruct his perfect sight. These are therefore to desire you to renew your prayers to make this second operation completely successful. And Mrs. Jones passed away in 1720. Congenital cataracts are sometimes associated with developmental disability, but there is no evidence of intellectual disability in the Dolins children. When Mary died at age 16 in February of 1719, the family minister, Daniel Mayo, recalled that she was desirous to instruct her younger brother and sister and delighted to converse about religious matters with her older brother, Abraham. Mary had suffered for some time from consumption with pain and frequent coughing. Her eyes were apparently fine, as even to the end she read the Bible and Mr. Baxter's dying thoughts. Abraham died at age 19 in 1720. Now, what I'm showing you here is the newspaper report, which tells us the name of Cheselden's famous patient. Daniel Dolins, the son, was born on April 2nd, 1713. On March 14th, 1727, the Daily Journal in London contained the first public notice of any eye surgery by Cheselden. Mr. Cheselden, a surgeon of St. Thomas's Hospital, presented to Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, a son of Sir Daniel Dolins of Hackney, that was born blind, having had cataracts, whom he had restored to sight by couching, and had the honor to kiss Her Royal Highness's hand. Historians have not previously noted this newspaper report, which permits us to identify Daniel Dolins as Cheselden's famous patient. In October of 1727, Caroline was crowned queen following the death of King George I. In December of 1727, Cheselden was named the surgeon to Queen Caroline. Dolins, Berkeley, and Cheselden belonged to the same social networks. The fact that Berkeley was directly linked with the family of Cheselden's patient, the Dolins family, has not been previously published. Moreover, the social ties between Berkeley and Cheselden have not been explored. The senior Dolins was one of the governors of St. Thomas's Hospital from 1714 to 1725. Surgeon William Cheselden joined the hospital staff in 1718. Berkeley spent most of the years 1724 through 1728 in London and was elected to the Society for Promotion of Christian Knowledge in 1725. The senior Dolins had been a member of this society since 1710 and appears to have made Berkeley's acquaintance. Berkeley planned to found a university in Bermuda, which he would lead as president. Berkeley established a committee of prominent citizens who could receive contributions for this effort. Berkeley's committee, announced on July 15, 1725, included Sir Daniel Dolins of Kent. He also included, Sir Daniel Dolins Knight. He also included the Reverend Dr. Richard Mayo, treasurer to the Society for Promotion of Christian Knowledge at St. Thomas's Hospital, and this was the brother of the Dolins family minister. Berkeley's committee also included John Arbuthnot, a friend of Cheselden, with whom Berkeley had previously corresponded and also discussed philosophy while visiting Arbuthnot for dinner. Another link between Cheselden and Berkeley is Alexander Pope, the poet. Basically, they had the same best friend in Alexander Pope. In 1722, Pope requested that Cheselden write down lines from Shakespeare that Cheselden had mentioned to Arbuthnot. In fact, Cheselden played a role in editing Pope's 1725 edition of Shakespeare. While preparing the book, Pope wrote to a colleague, "Let friend Cheselden be of ye party." Even though Cheselden was his doctor, Pope referred to him as friend Cheselden several times. Pope frequently ate dinner at Cheselden's home, and when Pope needed medical treatment in 1736, he stayed there. Pope implied that Cheselden advised him about his own eyes and notified Cheselden when there were cataracts to be operated on in Bath. Cheselden was with Pope during his final illness. Berkeley was also very close with Pope. The two met in 1713 when both contributed essays to Steele's Guardian. One of Pope's Guardian essays mirrors the themes in Berkeley's New Theory of Vision, suggesting that Pope had read it, even though it had only been published in Dublin. Berkeley and Pope shared dinner with a friend in 1721 when Berkeley stayed with Pope for a week. Pope invited Berkeley, writing, "As I take you to be almost the only friend I have that is above the little vanities of the town." During 1726 and 1727, when Berkeley was putting together funding for his proposed Bermuda College, he asked Pope to translate a poem, some lines of which Berkeley inserted in his Bermuda literature. Berkeley had originally met Caroline, the Princess of Wales, in 1712 after his earliest philosophical works were published. It is conceivable that the philosophical implications of Molyneux Questions would have come up early in their relationship, given that Berkeley had just published on the question, and that they were introduced by Molyneux's son Samuel. During this London period from 1724 to 1728, Berkeley debated philosophy and theology weekly in front of the intellectual Caroline. One joint acquaintance of Berkeley and Cheselden, who ultimately publicized the surgery, was Voltaire, who, while living in London from 1726 to 1728, also met with Pope and the Princess of Wales. Voltaire later wrote that he had seen a great deal of Cheselden, and handwrote a dedication to Cheselden in his 1738 Philosophie. Voltaire also wrote that the celebrated Cheselden, one of the greatest surgeons in London, told me that it was he who first caused surgical instruments to be manufactured in that city in 1715. Likewise, Voltaire indicated that he discussed philosophy several times with Berkeley while in England. Cheselden's only ophthalmic publications outside the chapter on the eye in his anatomy treatise were two curious reports published together in 1728 in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London. The first report concerned the perceptions and emotions of a 13-year-old boy who had been blind from a young age and was then couched. The patient was referred to as a gentleman, as one would expect for the son of a knight. In the 1730 edition of his anatomy text, Cheselden included this report and wrote, "I have couched several others who were born blind, whose observations were of the same kind, but they being younger, none of them gave so full an account as this young gentleman." This note helps to establish that the 1728 report was about Daniel, because the small number of other children operated on by Cheselden were younger. An analysis of the 1728 report reveals that although the tone of the report implies that Daniel could see better, it is not actually specified that he could perform additional visual tasks. And the report used language more characteristic of Berkeley than of Cheselden. To illustrate the latter, we have looked for words that were used in Berkeley's writings, but never by Cheselden in a database of period texts. The report was ambiguous about whether Daniel's visual dysfunction was congenital. The report described a young gentleman who was born blind or lost his sight so early that he had no remembrance of ever having seen. Both the newspaper report mentioning Cheselden and Cheselden's anatomy text addendum implied that Daniel was born blind. He was blind from his infancy, according to Berkeley. Daniel was blind from the age of about 2 years, according to the most unbiased source, his longtime tutor. The author suggested that Daniel could see better postoperatively by including vague statements, such as alluding to the postoperative period, quote, when he first saw, end quote. In addition, quote, a year after first seeing, end quote, Daniel said he had a, quote, a new kind of seeing, end quote. Daniel anticipated he would someday be able to perform numerous visual tasks, reading, writing, walking abroad. The reader might suppose that eventually Daniel could perform some of these tasks. In fact, no improvement in performance of any visual task is specified. The report was clear that even several months after the surgery, Daniel could not visually distinguish a cat from a dog. We know from Daniel's tutor that Daniel was never able to read. Daniel's positive emotions after surgery were mentioned in the 1728 report, apparently in an attempt to suggest an improved vision. He was alternately surprised, delighted, amazed, and felt pleasure. Various sights were a delight or pleasing. Referring to Cheselden in the third person, the author related Daniel's emotions. Quote, his gratitude to his operator he could not conceal, never seen him for some time without tears of joy in his eyes and other marks of affection. And if he did not happen to come at any time when he was expected, he would be so grieved that he could not forbear crying at his disappointment. Now, how could Cheselden know what occurred in his absence? The report was signed Cheselden with 2 S's, which is not how Cheselden spelled his name in his publications. The fact that the 1728 report was narrated in the plural form, we, suggests that it might have been a multi-author work. Berkeley, a cleric and philosopher, frequently discussed the words of emotion, sensory processes, and certain idiosyncratic expressions that we've identified, and Cheselden did not. The observations of the 13-year-old Daniel were suspiciously similar to those of Berkeley. It was not until about 2 months after surgery that Daniel discovered that pictures, quote, represented solid bodies instead of, quote, party-colored planes or surfaces diversified with a variety of paint, end quote. In 1709, Berkeley had written that, quote, what we strictly see are not solids, nor yet planes variously colored. They are only diversity of colors, end quote. Daniel, quote, asked which was the line sense, feeling or seeing, end quote. Berkeley reviewed the teachings of the philosopher Heraclitus, who, quote, used to call eyesight a line sense, end quote. The 13-year-old Daniel thought objects looked extremely large, end quote. Daniel's questioner found him, quote, never being able to imagine any lines beyond the bounds he saw. The room he was in, he said, he knew to be but part of the house, yet he could not conceive that the whole house could look bigger, end quote. Who asked Daniel at his home whether he could imagine lines extending beyond the bounds that he saw? Here is Berkeley writing about mathematics. Quote, the mind finds no difficulty in conceiving them, mathematical expressions, to be continued beyond any assignable bounds. Elsewhere, Berkeley wrote, mathematicians do not conceive or imagine lines or surfaces less than what are perceivable to the sense. End quote. Daniel's preoperative perception of colors is described in the 1728 report as only producing, quote, faint ideas, end quote, in his mind. Berkeley, who viewed real objects as only existing in the mind, repeatedly described ideas as being faint. In 1733, Berkeley claimed that his theories about perceptions after sudden acquisition of vision were not a little confirmed by the 1728 report. The accompanying report by Cheselden in the 1728 transactions concerned the production of an incision through the iris, i.e. iridotomy. This report is written in a completely different style, and there's no reason to doubt Cheselden's authorship. Cheselden matter-of-factly recounts how he cut the iris in the first person singular without mentioning the patient's emotions. We actually learn more about the clinical course not from the 1728 report, but from Kennedy, the surgeon, who wrote that 6 months after the operation on the last eye, the child felt something in his eye which seemed to him to give a crack. The globe was inflamed and painful, with turbid aqueous humor and a great flux of watery humor, probably from the lacrimal gland. Kennedy supposed that the clinical picture might have been due to rupture of the crystalline lens, although it also could have been a perforated cornea. Kennedy had spoken with, quote, the parent of Daniel, and wrote in 1739, far from being able to read or write therewith, it seems even to be with considerable difficulty that he can guide himself along with some assistance, and he still knows Puss, the cat, much better by his feeling than he does by his seeing. In 1728, Sir Daniel Dolins passed away. The Cheselden report was published, and George Berkeley got married and headed for America, intending to start his Bermuda College. The 1728 report ultimately became influential when Voltaire publicized it in France, and the report of Cheselden continues to be cited liberally in the modern era. However, the funds for Berkeley's Bermuda College were never dispersed by the government, and Berkeley returned to London in 1731. In 1734, he wrote that he no longer attended Caroline's court. It was Surgeon John Ranby, rather than Cheselden, who was asked to attend to Queen Caroline when she was dying from a hernia. Now, the 1728 report on recovery from congenital blindness must have interested John Eames, a Fellow of the Royal Society. Eames was a clergyman and taught the writings of John Locke as well as anatomy, as well as 1617, and he helped to lead the Fund Academy, which trained dissenting clergymen. This academy, for some reason, subsequently placed tutors in Daniel's home for the remainder of his life. We can assume that Daniel's continued poor vision was familiar to Eames by 1734 when he edited an abridged version of the Transactions, which included the 1728 report about Daniel. Daniel's first tutor was William Ford, who left to become ordained as a minister in December of 1730. Eames replaced Ford with Isaac Thoms, who lived with the family for 11 years. Tom's memoirs recounted, quote, from the age of 2 years, this amiable youth, Daniel, had been almost blind, a circumstance which greatly increased the labor of Mr. Thoms, who constantly read to or conversed with him 8 hours in the day on the subjects of religion or science. Thoms was still living in the family in 1742 when a friend wrote sending his regards to Mr. Dolins and recounting how the oculist John Taylor, a former Cheselden student, was healing the blind in Bath. The cataracts in the Dolins brothers were probably hereditary, and it is unlikely that the precise cause can be determined after 3 centuries. There are a variety of different gene mutations which can cause isolated autosomal recessive cataracts. It is tempting, though, to speculate on a single disorder to explain the brothers' entire clinical picture. Singer syndrome is an autosomal recessive disorder resulting in cataracts which are typically congenital, as in Abraham's case, but can occur at a few years of age, as may have occurred in Daniel's case. Singer syndrome is associated with normal mental development, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, skeletal myopathy, and lactic acidosis. The syndrome can result in chronic disability, followed in its milder form by death near the 3rd decade of life, as occurred in the Dolins brothers. The initial series and many subsequent cases have been reported from the Netherlands, where the Dolins family hailed. In Iceland, which had a population of 244,000 in 1988, 6 cases were identified for a prevalence of about 1 in 40,000 in that country. Well, publication standards in those days were different, and in our paper we document instances where Berkeley published under pseudonyms and when Cheselden may have published other people's ideas under his own name. And we may never know with certainty whether Berkeley wrote the report describing the eye surgery in his colleague's son, but it certainly is misleading because in reality Daniel Dolins never really did see better after the procedure. And in fact, congenital cataract surgery is a flawed model to answer the Molyneux question because cataract surgery doesn't typically suddenly give you great vision due to amblyopia. Now, Daniel Dolins had wanted to purchase a country estate to erect a chapel. However, his plans did not come to fruition, and he died in July of 1743. On Tuesday last died Daniel Dolins, a gentleman as generally esteemed as known, who with all that was obliging had good sense and furniture of mind. He was an ardent lover of truth, and under peculiar disadvantages arising from a defective sight, searched diligently for it, He died after a long illness, but not till he had said a little before death, "My sufferings are nothing, and I am happy."